Who is Jesus? That seemingly simple question has divided the course of religious history for all of humanity. To Christianity, he is the only begotten Son of God, the Redeemer. To Islam, he is merely a prophet, miraculously born, but not divine, not crucified, and not resurrected. Two theological systems, two historical narratives, two ways of telling the story of the same man, and billions of followers on each side. But what if both have missed something? Not because they were deceitful, but because they were never handed the full original blueprint. Imagine this. You're assembling a massive puzzle, but only have half the map. Every piece seems to fit until you realize there's a gap at the center, one that no piece can fill. The question of Jesus' true identity might just be that missing piece. Throughout centuries of theological debate, very few have questioned a foundational assumption. Has our understanding, whether it's called the Bible or the Quran, ever truly been complete? We've asked, is Jesus God? But rarely have we paused to ask, who decided which texts were valid to tell his story? And then, there is a book, the Book of Jubilees, excluded from both orthodox traditions. It's not part of the New Testament. It's not mentioned in Islam, an ancient Jewish text, once preserved by the Qumran community, once held in equal esteem with Genesis and Exodus. And yet, it was set aside. Why? Maybe because it didn't serve the institutional church. Maybe because it was too ancient to be fully understood, or maybe because it holds an undeveloped theological thread, that the covenant did not begin at Sinai, but in Eden, that the law wasn't a product of Moses, but was given to Adam, that the first sacrifice was not the cross, but the blood of Abel, and that Jesus did not arrive as a historical anomaly, but as the culmination of a hidden stream of salvation flowing since the dawn of creation. If that is true, then both Christianity and Islam may be debating over a story that has been shortened, and Jubilees, the forgotten book, might just be the missing part. Have you ever wondered why, when people speak of the story of salvation, they only begin with Abraham or Moses or the prophecy of Isaiah? Why every sermon on the covenant begins after the fall, as if Eden were just a mythical prologue rather than the sacred beginning of history? And why so few churches, whether Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox, ever mention an ancient book called Jubilees, even though it was preserved alongside Genesis and Exodus in many ancient manuscripts? Could it be that certain pieces of the truth were left off the table, not because they were false, but because they were too early or too deep to be retained? Jubilees is not merely a summary of Genesis. It is a retelling with details omitted, time obscured, and meaning compressed in the modern biblical canon. It says, "The law did not begin at Sinai, but at Eden," that Adam was taught the law, that Abel offered his sacrifice by divine standard, that Noah renewed the covenant with God through offering, that Abraham kept the Sabbath even before Moses. And it adds one more truth. God does not act randomly, but according to a 49-year cycle called the Jubilees, where major historical events are marked, orchestrated, and linked like interlocking chains in an unbreakable plan. But have you ever heard a sermon about that? In Bible classes, in catechism, in mission studies, in theology courses? Have you ever been told that Jesus appeared at a precise Jubilee point as the culmination of a sacred cycle, and not just the 30th year in the reign of Caesar? Perhaps you have never heard it, not because your faith is lacking, but because no one ever told you. Perhaps Jubilees was left out of the official canon because it did not serve a pre-established religious order. But truth does not vanish when it's removed from a list. It lives on, quietly, waiting for someone to turn the page. And when it reappears, it makes what once seemed complete suddenly feel unfinished. If Eden truly was the beginning of the covenant, then perhaps you were invited into the middle of the feast without ever hearing the beginning of the invitation, and that is not your fault. But now you can ask, why did no one tell me? And you can begin to read again, not to change your faith, but to restore the missing piece. In most sermons, Jesus is introduced as a major turning point, a new milestone that opens the New Testament, beginning a covenant distinct from the Old. But what if Jesus was not a historical shift, but the perfect continuation of a sacred stream that existed long before Abraham? The Book of Jubilees offers us a radically different lens. It doesn't embellish new stories, but completes the loose threads left dangling. In this telling, Abel is not merely the first victim of envy, but the first person to properly understand sacrifice. When Cain offers produce from the ground, Abel offers the firstborn lamb, innocent blood without blemish, and God accepts it. From the very beginning, there was a whisper that communion with God could never exist apart from sacrifice. Then comes Enoch, who, according to Jubilees, walked with God so faithfully that he was taken into heaven without tasting death. Enoch becomes a foreshadowing of what would later be called ascension. A human being can transcend the flesh, not through philosophy, but through faithful obedience to the law and the covenant. Noah enters during a corrupted era when, according to Jubilees, humanity's bloodline had been altered by fallen angels. When he steps out of the ark, the first thing he does is offer sacrifice, and God renews the covenant, not just with him, but with all of humanity. A new beginning, yet still rooted in tradition, sacrifice, law, covenant, sacred time. Then comes Abraham. Long before the Exodus, Jubilee says Abraham observed the Sabbath. Even before Moses, he built altars, offered sacrifices, practiced circumcision, and followed a sacred 364-day calendar given by God from the time of creation. Abraham didn't create a new faith. He preserved and upheld an ancient covenant, one that Adam had lost. So what connects all these people? They lived before Israel, before Sinai, before the New Testament. Yet they all understood this. To walk rightly with God requires holding fast to what he established, whether through the blood of lambs, the mark of circumcision, the observance of the Sabbath, or total obedience. And they, each of them, were the sacred soil prepared for the Redeemer to enter history, not as a disruption, but as the harvest of a seed sown in Eden. Jesus did not appear by chance. He did not break the timeline. He came as the final seed in a lineage of faithful seeds, only to become the seed buried in the earth, giving rise to the eternal season of the covenant. When we read Genesis, we often feel like everything happens quickly. Creation, Eden, the temptation, the fall, exile. It all seems to occur in just a few lines, a few chapters. Adam and Eve are created, and then they sin. But what really happened in the silent space between those verses? Genesis is the tip of the iceberg. but Jubilees reveals the depths below. According to Jubilees chapter 3, Adam and Eve did not fall immediately. They lived in the Garden of Eden for a full 7 years, without breaking a single command, without separation from God. During those 7 years, they kept the covenant, obeyed, and lived in holiness. This isn't a myth. It's a testimony that humanity once had the capacity to live faithfully under God's law. It's a detail Genesis leaves vague, but Jubilees makes clear. And once you know it, you'll no longer see the fall as an instant collapse, but rather the slow dimming of light after a time of true holiness. But Jubilees reveals something else, something Genesis only hints at. God didn't just create time, He sanctified it. Not just the 7th day of the week, but all of history was divided into 49-year cycles called Jubilee years. Each Jubilee is a sacred unit, a heartbeat in the bloodstream of redemptive time. From creation to the flood, from Noah to Abraham, from the Exodus to the Messiah, everything fits within that structure. Major events do not happen by chance, but exactly on time in their appointed Jubilee season. This doesn't just reshape how we see biblical history, it restores the sacred order of time itself. And if time was sanctified from Eden, then Jesus' appearance, His death, His resurrection were not a backup plan after the law had failed. He came at the appointed time, during the Jubilee of Jubilees, a moment that should never have been obscured in sacred history, but has been blurred by what Genesis left unsaid. It's not that Genesis is wrong, only that it did not tell the whole story, and what it didn't tell, Jubilees quietly whispers to those patient enough to listen. We are often told that the law, God's commandments, were given to the people of Israel through Moses on Mount Sinai. That was when the covenant was formally established. The people were called, the law was given, the nation was born. And from then on, it is often assumed that the law was exclusive to Israel. But what if that isn't true? What if the law came before the people, before Israel, before even Abraham? According to Jubilees, the law existed from Eden. Adam did not live by instinct. He was taught the law, given commandments, shown what is holy and what leads to death. It wasn't just do not eat the forbidden fruit, but a whole divine order of life. Keeping the Sabbath, knowing how to offer sacrifices, distinguishing between the clean and unclean. When Abel offered his sacrifice correctly and God accepted it, it wasn't luck. It was because Abel knew the law. When Enoch was taken up into heaven without tasting death, it wasn't because he was morally superior, but because he faithfully kept God's law in a wicked generation. When Noah renewed the covenant after the flood, he knew what to do, what to offer, because he had been taught the law by his forefathers. Even Abraham, according to Jubilees, observed the Sabbath, practiced circumcision, and followed God's sacred calendar long before Sinai. These men were not Jews. They were not yet a chosen people, but they kept the law as a sacred reflex passed down from Eden. So what does that mean for how we see Jesus? It means he didn't come to start something new. He did not break the law. He did not replace the old covenant. He came to fulfill what was there from the beginning. If the law was given from Eden, then Jesus is the only one in history who kept that law perfectly, not only in action, but in heart. He kept it not when the world was still holy, like Adam, but in a world corrupted, soaked with Abel's blood, Cain's sin and the silence of a forgotten covenant. Keeping the law in the light is hard, but keeping the law in the dark is the truest fulfillment. And that is why Jesus did not abolish, but fulfilled. He did not reject, but restored the original shape of the covenant. He is the new Adam, the new Enoch, the new Noah, the new Abraham, and more than that, the fulfillment of all those who once kept the law in part, pointing toward a future they could not yet see. Because the law is not merely words, the law is a path, and he is the Word become the way. What makes Jesus different? Not that he performed more miracles than the prophets, not that he preached more eloquently or drew greater crowds, not even that he died on a cross, because many have died unjustly for ideals or for others. Nor is it simply because he was called Son of God, as even patriarchs and kings were once given such titles. So why does Jesus divide history in two? Perhaps because he didn't come to begin something new, but to reconnect something very ancient. According to Jubilees, the entire history of humanity from Eden has been a struggle to keep the covenant from falling apart. When Adam fell, the covenant was not destroyed, but handed down to those brave enough to keep the law in a broken world. Those people were Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, each one a flickering lamp preserving a part of the sacred covenant. But over time, the darkness grew thicker. The law was forgotten. Worship was replaced by empty ritual. The covenant became bureaucracy instead of the lifeblood between man and God. People began to live as if the covenant belonged to one nation, one era, one system. They forgot that the first covenant was not made at Sinai, but in Eden, and the first law was not written in stone, but engraved in blood and obedience. Jesus came into that moment, not to establish what we now call Christianity, but to restore the severed bloodline. He came not as a reformer, but as the final heir of a sacred lineage, those who lived by the covenant and died for the law. He did not speak anything against Abel, Enoch, or Abraham. He completed everything they lived, but left unfinished. He did not create a new covenant to erase the old, but to fulfill the original covenant with his own blood. That's why Jesus is not different because he is foreign to salvation history. He is different because he is the only one who could weave all the scattered threads into a single bloodline, flowing back to Eden. And if you ever thought Jesus was the beginning of a new faith, perhaps now is the time to see. He didn't open a new story. He is the final chapter of a sacred song that had once been cut short. If all God needed was for humans to repent, he could have sent hundreds, thousands of prophets as he did in the scriptures. And indeed, in both the Bible and the Quran, God did exactly that. From Noah to Abraham, from Moses to Isaiah, from John the Baptist to Muhammad, according to Islamic belief. Each one called people back to God, to keep his commandments, to live righteously. But if proclamation alone were enough, then why is there still suffering? Why is there still a gap between what we know and how we live? The Book of Jubilees asks a deeper question. Have there been distortions not only in human behavior, but in the very structure of humanity itself? According to Jubilees and the Qumran texts, after the fallen angels, called the Watchers, abandoned their appointed place, they intervened in the human bloodline. They fathered the Nephilim, beings that were half human, half divine, and implanted within humanity a kind of dark memory, a spiritual infection. The fall was no longer merely a matter of breaking laws, but a deformation within the soul itself. The law was still given. Prophets were still sent, but once the lifeblood of salvation had been tainted, no teaching alone could purify what had been corrupted deep within human nature. From the murder of Abel, to the Tower of Babel, to the time of the flood, to the golden calf forged by Israel, each of these reflected a systemic deviation that could not be healed by outward instruction or regulation alone. And in that context, Jesus did not come merely to preach. He came to restore, not with argument, but through sacrifice, not to teach about the soul, but to touch the very fracture within the soul itself. If Jesus were only a prophet, then his presence would not have been so necessary. But if he is the Word made flesh, the covenant embodied, then he came not only to speak to humanity, but to reconnect a divine order that had been broken in the spiritual realm. No prophet, not even the greatest, could do that. Only one who did not carry the corrupted bloodline could touch the deepest wound in humanity and cleanse it from within. Jesus didn't merely speak truth. He lived it and let that truth pierce his own body to heal an ancient wound. So, if someone asks, why do we need Jesus? The answer isn't in doctrine. It lies in the question itself. Has your soul ever known a fracture? If yes, then he is not merely a prophet. He is the restoration you could never grant yourself. We are often taught that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and that no one can disrupt his plan. But if that is true, then a very challenging question arises, especially from the Islamic perspective. Why did the presence of Jesus, a man born miraculously, endowed with power, called the Messiah, leave behind the most widespread legacy of mistaken worship in human history? According to Islam, Jesus was a great prophet, but people misunderstood him. They deified him, worshipped him instead of the one who sent him. They built a religion centered around his mistaken identity instead of returning to the purity of Tawheed. And the result is, billions of people over 2,000 years have gone astray. But if that is true, then hasn't God's plan failed? He sent a messenger, and the only thing the world remembers is worshipping him wrongly. Could a divine plan really result in consequences greater than its intended purpose? Jubilees answers with a different vision. It reveals that God does not act reactively, but cyclically. He does not improvise. He preordained every moment, every event, every pulse in the rhythm of redemptive history. From Eden, he established the 49-year cycles, Jubilees, as the sacred structure of time. Not only the Sabbath year, but the entire timeline of humanity was divided into moments of restoration, where debts were forgiven, lands returned, servants released, and the covenant renewed. And in that flow, nothing happens outside its appointed time. Not the death of Abel, not the flood, not Israel's exile, and certainly not the arrival of Jesus. If Jesus truly is the one chosen by God, then no one could ruin that plan. No misunderstanding, no religion, no political or theological system, because he came on time as a living Jubilee to restore the covenant, not with ink, but with flesh, with blood, with a moment that cannot be replaced. If he was misunderstood, then even that misunderstanding was anticipated in the cycle, and for that reason, everything will be made clear in due time. God's plan cannot fail. Because he didn't write it by hand, he engraved it on the axis of time. And every event, even the misunderstanding of Jesus, is the movement of a greater rotation, one that only those who remember Jubilees can trace by its heartbeat. So the question is no longer, was Jesus misunderstood? But rather, are you stepping into the appointed season of a plan that cannot fail? People often believe that if someone performs miracles, heals the sick, raises the dead, walks on water, multiplies food, then he must be from God. In both Christianity and Islam, Jesus is recognized as a miraculous figure. But then the road splits. For Christianity, miracles signify divinity. For Islam, they are acts permitted by God through a prophet's hands. So, who is right? Or better yet, is there something deeper? Jubilees gives us a different lens. In it, those chosen by God are not defined by signs and wonders, but by their ability to keep the covenant in the midst of a rebellious generation. What marks someone as righteous is not miracles, but steadfast faithfulness to the law while others have forgotten it. Abel performed no miracles, but he offered the right sacrifice and was killed for it. Enoch did not control the weather, but he walked with God until he was taken into heaven. Noah did not prophesy, but kept himself pure in a generation of corrupted bloodlines. Abraham performed no public wonders, but he kept the Sabbath, circumcision, and lived the covenant before Moses was even born. None of them are described as miracle workers, but all of them are seen as pillars holding the covenant in a broken history. In that light, Jesus did not come to impress. His miracles, if anything, were not for spectacle, but to confirm a deeper truth, that he was the only one who kept the law not during peace, but in the deepest darkness. Jesus himself said, "I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it." Not fulfill it with mere actions, but with his entire life, his mind, his death. If all a prophet needed to do was preach and perform wonders, then dozens came before him. But if humanity needed someone to fully restore the covenant by keeping the law with both soul and body, then there could only be one. Miracles anyone can perform if given the power. But to perfectly keep the law in a fallen world and lead others back to the covenant, only the Redeemer can do that. That is why divinity is not proven by the unexplainable, but by this: he never once stepped outside the sacred boundaries of God, even when pushed to the very edge. And that alone, not the wonders, is the greatest miracle of all time. From the Islamic view, Jesus is one of the greatest prophets. But then he was misunderstood. People confused him for God, built a religion around a mistaken identity, and worshipped the one sent instead of the one who sent him. And because of that misunderstanding, billions for 2 millennia have gone astray, dragging with them vast religious institutions. If that is true, then the question is not just, how far did humanity err, but how deeply did God fail? If Jesus were only a prophet and humanity immediately deified him, then hasn't God's plan been quickly and catastrophically distorted? And if Satan, God's ancient enemy, could turn the sent one into an object of false worship, then hasn't Satan won? But perhaps it's not so simple. Jubilees does not mention Jesus directly, but it gives us a theological timeline that invites us to reconsider the accusation. According to Jubilees, history is not a string of surprises, but a series of preordained cycles. In every age, there is a season of fall, misinterpretation and purification, from Cain killing Abel to Babel, to the corruption by the watchers, to Israel forgetting the law in the wilderness. Each was a moment when the covenant was misunderstood, distorted, or forgotten. And yet, astonishingly, in every cycle, God already knew and still continued to send the covenant. So, if Jesus was misunderstood, it is not a failure, but part of the test cycle, foreseen and anticipated. It is not a collapse outside the plan, but the first step into the final stage of the covenant, purification. Just as Abel died, and his death became a testimony to rejected divine justice, the death and misunderstanding of Jesus may be the strongest witness to what must be restored. That true righteousness is not based on being immediately understood, but on the fact that God never gives up on those who misunderstand. If Jesus is the Son of the covenant, then misunderstanding him is not the triumph of darkness, but the mirror revealing that the light still shines, even when refracted through a broken lens. In that cycle, what matters is not how well the world understands, but this: does God stop saving? And the answer, throughout Jubilees, is no. He does not fail, because he already foresaw the misunderstanding. And instead of abandoning, he sent one who could endure every misinterpretation, yet still carry the light of the covenant. Jesus did not fail. He endured a failing world without losing the mission. And that is the true sign of the one sent from eternity. When people look at the cross, they often see a symbol of sorrow, a failure, an ending. To many, it was the moment Jesus collapsed under the weight of darkness, betrayed, beaten, crucified, and then dead. In the Islamic lens, such a thing is unthinkable. A great prophet like Jesus could not be humiliated like that, so he was taken up and someone else was crucified in his place. But what if death is not failure? What if the cross is not an end, but a junction point in covenant history? Jubilees does not tell of the cross, but it tells us something vital. The death of the righteous is never meaningless. From the beginning, with Abel, the first to die, Jubilees records that he offered sacrifice according to God's standard, and because of it, he was killed. His blood cried out to heaven, and God listened. The first death in human history did not come from illness or accident, but from righteousness. And from that moment, a sacred law was etched into the bloodstream of time. When the innocent die for the sake of truth, their blood does not fall to the earth in vain. Noah offered sacrifice after the flood, and the covenant was renewed. Abraham was willing to offer his son, and he was counted as righteous. Jacob built an altar after his dream, and the angel appeared. Every sacrifice, every shedding of blood offered in its true meaning has always been tied to a renewal of the covenant. So when Jesus walked toward the cross, he was not walking into death. He was stepping into the oldest ritual of the covenant, offering what is most precious to cleanse what has been most defiled. He was not seized. He gave himself. He was not forced. He willingly stepped into the role of Abel, but on a scale of global redemption. He was not merely a righteous man killed. He was the righteous one who knew he would be killed and still entered in, because he came to rescue those who no longer knew the way back to the covenant. In this light, the cross is no longer the end. It is the final altar, where the blood of the Lamb is no longer symbolic, but real, where the covenant is no longer written in ink, but in a body offered, broken, to renew the entire structure of salvation. If Abel is the first image, then Jesus is the complete fulfillment. If Abel's blood caused God to hear the cry for justice, then Jesus' blood opened a path home that no one else could open. So if you have ever looked at the cross as a failure, look again through the eyes of Jubilees. Every death for the covenant is a beginning, and the death of Jesus is the final beginning. Not because he lost his life, but because he chose to give it, so the covenant would never be lost again. In the Quran, the death of Jesus is explicitly denied. They did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but it only appeared so to them. According to Islamic tradition, someone else was crucified in his place, while Jesus was taken up, peacefully, innocently, spared from the shame of the cross. For many Muslims, this is seen as a mark of God's favor, that he would not allow a prophet as great as Jesus to suffer such a disgraceful death. But if that belief is true, what then became of the covenant? In Jubilees, from its very first pages, the covenant is always accompanied by one inseparable element: sacrifice. No covenant is established without blood. No renewal takes place without offering. Abel died, and his blood was the opening chapter in a long history of righteous bloodshed. Noah, after surviving the flood, offered the first sacrifice to purify the land again. Abraham prepared to offer Isaac. The patriarchs built altars, not for decoration, but to mark the forming or renewal of a covenant. So if Jesus is the Redeemer, the one who fulfills the covenant, the living Jubilee, then he could not avoid death, not because God is cruel, but because this is the sacred structure of all restoration. Without blood, there is no covenant. To deny the death of Jesus is to sever him from the lineage of the patriarchs. It is to turn him into an exceptional prophet, disconnected from the stream of sacrifice that began with Abel. It is to reject the very key that reopens the locked covenant, because the final altar would then be bloodless. And if that's the case, you no longer have a complete covenant, you only have a message. But God did not just send a message, he embodied a promise and signed it with his own death. The death of Jesus was not an accident, nor the product of human conspiracy. It was the final sacred mark, the essential event in the mechanism of humanity's spiritual restoration. Just as the Father in Jubilees could not reclaim his Son without offering what was most precious, so too God could not reclaim us without offering himself. So the question is no longer, did Jesus die? But rather, if he didn't die, who will complete the unfinished part of the covenant? And if there is no one else holy enough, willing enough, perfect enough, then the promise will remain suspended between heaven and earth, with no one to fulfill it. But Jesus did die, so the promise is no longer a hypothesis. He is the blood upon the final altar and the life within the final covenant. When people speak of dying for their faith, they often think of early church martyrs or Old Testament prophets. But few remember that the first to die for living rightly under God's law was not a prophet, it was Abel. In Jubilees, the story of Cain and Abel is not merely a family tragedy. It is the opening chapter of sacrificial history, of blood history, of covenant history. Abel did not simply offer a sacrifice, he offered the correct sacrifice. Jubilees emphasizes, Abel offered the firstborn of his flock with the best fat. It was not random, not emotional. He knew what was holy, and he did it. And precisely because he did it right, he was killed. Cain was not merely jealous. He was enraged that God distinguished between right and wrong. and the one who lived rightly became the target of the one who lived crookedly. Abel's death was the first death for theological reasons, for keeping the covenant rightly. When Jesus walked toward the cross, he did nothing other than live that same faithfulness on a total level. He was the only one who never faltered in keeping the law, yet was treated as a lawbreaker. And just like Abel, his blood was not meaningless. The author of Hebrews writes, "The blood of Jesus speaks a better word than the blood of Abel." But this does not dismiss Abel. It confirms that Jesus stepped into Abel's path, not just to be killed, but to fulfill. Abel died in silence, and his blood cried from the ground. Jesus died in the crowd, and his blood opened a path from earth to heaven. They did not fail. They opened the way. Abel as a warning that righteousness will always be opposed. Jesus as the fulfillment that no death for the law is wasted if it is placed within the eternal covenant. If you've ever felt alone in doing what is right, if you've been wounded for pursuing the holy while being misunderstood, then you are walking in the footsteps of Abel and are being accompanied by Jesus himself. For from the beginning, those who kept the law were never protected by weapons. They were kept by a promise that their blood would not fall in vain. And because of that, the history of salvation began with one who died for doing right, and was completed with one who died so no one would ever fear doing right again. We often think of salvation history as a linear timeline, with a beginning, pivotal moments, and an end. But in Jubilees, time does not simply move forward. It moves in cycles. Like the returning seasons, like the Sabbath that repeats every 7 days, God established a 49-year cycle called the Jubilee as the heartbeat of all sacred history. Each Jubilee is a cycle of restoration. It is when slaves are freed, land is returned, debts are forgiven, and the covenant is renewed. It is not just rest. Jubilee is a divine equation between time and grace. It declares that God still keeps the clock and will not let history break forever. In Jubilees, all of history, from creation to the flood to the promise to Abraham, is marked by Jubilee milestones. And if that is true, then Jesus' arrival could not be random. He came at the appointed time, not too early, not too late, to bring to an end a long cycle of downfall and to inaugurate the greatest Jubilee of all, the Jubilee of eternal forgiveness. Jesus did not come merely to teach wisdom or perform miracles. He came at the sacred moment when the cycles converged. Like a gate that opens only once every 49 years, his presence was God's response after centuries of silence, suffering, and longing. It is no coincidence that in the year he began his ministry, Jesus entered the synagogue and read from the prophet, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And then he said, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." The year of the Lord's favor, that is the Jubilee. He did not merely announce a season of grace, he was the living Jubilee. The presence of Jesus is the intersection of all cycles, where the old is fulfilled and the new begins, where the ancient covenant, once written on stone, is poured into flesh and blood, where laws, once forgotten, are resurrected in every step, every act of love, every drop of blood on the cross. If time is a sacred rotation, then Jesus is the axis at its center. He holds everything from falling into meaninglessness. He is the reason we believe there will always be a season for deliverance. Therefore, he did not come just to do something. He came at the precise moment when all other doors had closed, to reopen the final door, the door of the covenant. And those who can hear the heartbeat of Jubilee will know. There is no coincidence in salvation history, only moments appointed from eternity. From Eden to Abraham, from Moses to the prophets, from blood offerings to covenant renewals, the entire sacred history is a conversation between God and humanity. But it is not a balanced dialogue. One side is always faithful, the other hesitant, forgetful, unfaithful. Humanity could never fully keep what it promised, not because we are evil, but because we are wounded. Since Adam's fall, a fracture lies deep in the human soul, where goodness is veiled by desire, where divine law is exchanged for momentary compromise. Even when we know what is good, we lack the strength to follow it to the end. From Abel to Abraham, from Noah to David, some carried fragments of light, but none held it whole. The law was too high, the heart too frail, and sin was not just behavior, but a burden passed down through blood. So who could stand in that gap? Who is holy enough to keep the law, strong enough not to fall, free enough to carry the burden without being crushed? Only the only begotten Son, not an angel, not a moral leader, not a teacher, but the Son born from the heart of God, sent into history as a man. He was not immune to temptation, but never bowed. He did not avoid sinners, but was never tainted. He did not preach the law in cold language, but lived it in every act of love, every meal, every drop of sweat, every wound. He is the new Adam, yet did not fall. He is the new Abel, yet his blood opened the way of salvation. He is the new Moses, but not merely the bearer of the law. He became the living law. No one else could. No one else was chosen, for only he bore no trace of inherited sin, so he alone could carry it without being destroyed by it. If the entire covenant is an invitation, then Jesus is heaven's perfect response on behalf of earth. If humanity could not keep its promise, then God became man to keep it in our place, not to prove anything, but to reconnect what was severed, so that no one would ever again live with the shame of being too unholy to be near God. Because now God has drawn near, and with every step he took on dusty roads, a new hope began to echo. It is not that man must climb to heaven to find God, but that God bowed low, became man, to lift humanity back to where we belong. Many believe that the divinity of Jesus was an invention of the Church, a theological declaration developed gradually through councils, debates, and creeds. They believe the idea that Jesus is God did not exist at first, but was formed later to establish authority, doctrine, and religious identity. But what if all these arguments are looking too late? The Book of Jubilees does not name Jesus, but it paints an ancient theology where Jesus does not appear as someone added to Scripture, but as one sown even before Scripture was written. From Eden, God established the covenant. Adam did not live by instinct, he was taught the law. Abel knew what sacrifice was holy. Enoch walked with God and was taken up into heaven. Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all of them kept something that did not originate with man, but came from a plan sown at the beginning. Jubilees portrays history not as a random flow, but as a field sown in the right season, the right time, the right cycle. And within that timeline, some seeds were planted not to sprout immediately, but to wait for a divinely appointed season. Jesus is that seed, not a figure created by the church, but a quiet promise present since the time of the patriarchs. When Abel died, when Abraham kept the Sabbath, when Moses received the law, each of these moments looked ahead to one who would fulfill all of them on behalf of a humanity that could not. He did not come to begin a new religion. He is the climax of a history where all patriarchs were only shadows. If you've ever heard that the divinity of Jesus was a late concept, let Jubilees speak the opposite. He was always there, not by name, but by essence, like a current flowing beneath every covenant, every sacrifice, every promise. No one invented him. He was sown and waited for his appointed season to bear fruit. The church did not create his divinity. God revealed it gradually, through history, through blood, through Jubilee cycles, until the fullness of time. And once you see that, you'll realize Jesus is not just the main character of the Bible. He is the silent root of all salvation history from Eden, not made, but revealed. Not added later, but always there, even before we knew his name. Imagine being tasked with assembling an ancient map, but you begin with only half the pieces. Rivers are cut in half, mountain ranges are missing, cities do not connect with roads. You piece it together as best you can and think it's complete. But one day, someone hands you the missing pieces, and you suddenly realize the map you had was only half the story. Salvation history may have been read in the same way. We have Genesis, the story of beginnings. We have the Quran, words from heaven. We have the Gospels, the life of the Redeemer. Each book is a vital piece. But if you only piece together from these three, you may be missing something: the foundation. The Book of Jubilees, forgotten, excluded from official lists, removed from doctrine and preaching, is that missing piece. It doesn't replace any other text, but it links them together. It turns scattered fragments into an integrated design. It shows that the covenant began in Eden, not at Sinai. The law was taught to Adam, not only to Moses. Abel's sacrifice was not a guess, but a prototype. The arrival of Jesus was not a reaction, but a predetermined destination in God's cyclical timeline. Without Jubilees, we might think the law only belongs to Judaism, that grace only appeared with Christianity, that sacred time is just a mystical concept. But when Jubilees is placed back into its rightful place, something happens. The entire map comes to life. Suddenly, you're not forced to choose between the Bible and the Quran. You begin to see the deeper spring, where both once drank, before history branched off. You're not called to pick a side. You're invited to step back and see the full panorama, to understand that truth does not live in a single piece, but in the whole design. And the good news is, now you hold the missing piece, not to negate what you already believe, but to reinforce it with the foundation that was once hidden, not to erase, but to fulfill. If you've ever felt the pieces were disconnected, if you ever believed you understood the full story, but still sensed something was missing, perhaps what you lacked was Jubilees. And now you can reconnect that sacred thread, from Eden to Jesus, from the first promise to the final fulfillment, from fragment to fullness. There are memories that do not reside in the mind, but in the soul. No one teaches you to remember them, but when you hear them, something stirs deep inside, as if they had always been there. You just forgot. Jubilees doesn't merely recount details forgotten by the Bible. It awakens a sacred memory that you are not someone who entered the covenant halfway through, but one who carries within you a promise from Eden. When you read Jubilees, you realize Adam was taught the law. Abel did not die in vain. Abraham kept the Sabbath not out of religious obligation, but because he remembered the sacred calendar from creation. In today's world, we are flooded with data, information, and interpretation. But we lack one thing most of all: remembrance. Not memory of a concept, but the sacred memory of where we belong. And that is why Jesus came. He didn't just bring a message, he awakened the memory humanity had forgotten. When Jesus celebrated the Last Supper, he didn't say, "Understand this." He said, "Do this in remembrance of me." Not just to remember that he died, but to remember the entire covenant that had once been buried. He is the living memory of Eden, of the Sabbath, of the first sacrifices, of the original covenant, brought back to life in flesh, in tears, in blood. And if something in your heart stirs at the mention of Jubilees, perhaps it's because you are one of the few who still remember. Not because you are better than others, but because within you, the thread that connects to Eden has not been severed. You are not just a reader of Scripture. You are a keeper of memory, a gatherer of broken fragments of the covenant, piecing them together with faith, with listening, with humility, before something greater than doctrine, a promise that has never been forgotten. And if Jesus is the one who revives that promise, then you are invited not merely to understand. You are invited to remember, to guard, to pass it on to the next generation. Because some things only live if someone remembers, and some people only live rightly when they know what they are keeping. You may be one of them. Perhaps you've heard many debates about Jesus. Was he truly God? Did he really die on a cross? Is the Bible flawed? Does the Quran offer corrections? These questions have echoed for centuries, in lecture halls, in places of worship, on public stages, and now across social media. But after all of that, aren't you tired? When every argument only leads to more doubt. When everyone speaks to defend what they believe, but no one pauses to listen for what may have been forgotten. Because this is not a battle to win, not about who is right or wrong. It is an invitation to return. Return to what? To a covenant not made by man, not belonging to one nation, not boxed in by any denomination. A covenant sown in Eden, carried in the blood of Abel, illuminated in the steps of Enoch, strengthened in Abraham's faith, and fulfilled in the body of Jesus. If you're still reading, perhaps you don't need more reasoning. Perhaps what you need is space to breathe, to believe again, to feel that you are not lost in a sea of disconnected chapters. And Jubilees, the forgotten book, does not come to force you to pick a side. It comes as an ancient whisper that there is still a covenant burning in the hearts of those who remember. You don't need to win an argument. You are invited to become a keeper of the flame. Like Abel, who offered rightly, like Enoch, who walked faithfully, like Jesus, who loved perfectly to the very end. You don't need to understand everything. You only need to not let that flame go out in you. Because in the end, what remains is not debate, but life. A life that knows it belongs to the covenant. A life that holds the sacred, not out of obligation, but because it's the only way not to be swallowed by forgetfulness. You don't need applause, only a heart that refuses to stray from the promise. And if you're still here, still listening, perhaps you never really left. Perhaps today you are simply being reminded to remember and to return. You've journeyed through this story, through pages long forgotten, through figures pushed out of the spotlight, through truths that aren't always written in ink, but rise like a quiet call in the heart of one seeking their way back. And now you stand before a question no one else can answer for you. Do you still remember? Not memory of facts, not memory of debates, but a deeper memory, a sacred memory of the soul, that there once was a covenant from Eden, that humanity once walked with God, that every cycle, every sacrifice, every sign, from Abel to Abraham, pointed to one who would come not to invent a new religion, but to call humanity back to an ancient promise. And if Jesus truly is that stream sown from the beginning, not a product of the church, but the embodiment of the ancient covenant, then what will you do with this truth? You could stay silent, you could quietly carry on, as if you never heard it, or you could become one who keeps the flame. Because maybe you are one of the few who still remember. And if you remember, you cannot keep it only for yourself. Share it, speak it, not loudly, just truly and clearly, like a candle lit in the night. You could leave a comment, a question, a sigh, a testimony, because sometimes what awakens a generation is not a sermon, but the honest response of one who remembers. If someone in the dark is quietly wondering, does anyone still believe in the old covenant? Maybe you are the answer. And if so, then you are not just someone who finished a video. You are a keeper of a missing piece of sacred history. Don't let that memory sink into silence again, because there are stories only alive when someone tells them, and there are covenants only resurrected when someone lives as though they never forgot. Do you still remember? If you do, leave it below, because someone else might need to see they are not alone. Amen.